This video is all about conundrums. There are many different ways to do many different gardening tasks and to grow things. And on Gardener's Question Time, it's not unusual that we disagree with one another on a certain method. And I'm just going to highlight 10 or so of these that I come across a lot. And the first one is we all assume that roses growing on their own roots are inferior to those that are grafted. And most nurserymen in the UK, nearly all of them, produce them grafted, whereas in the States there's a big movement to growing them on their own roots. Now I'm standing here because I bought 2 Phyllis Buys. This is a repeat flowering rambling rose that I love. It's not looking at its best now because it's been so dry this summer. We've had no rain for weeks and months. But I bought 2 and I planted 1 each side of the door, and this guy survived and the one planted here didn't. So I took a cutting from this one and planted it there. And I was surprised that I thought, that it would look the sort of poor relation forever. But in 2 or 3 years, this one caught up and now is actually, I think, healthier. And there are lots of reasons for this. So firstly, when you grow a rose on its own roots, it doesn't have that graft union, which is a weak point. So if you're growing in a very cold climate or you're getting a cold, frosty burst, then obviously that is a weak point and they can get damaged. If you haven't got a grafting point, then you're not going to have that. They won't sucker if they are not grafted, but they will, and suckering's a pain. But having said that, a lot of the modern rootstocks, they don't sucker so much, or they're less inclined to, so it's not such a problem. But having said that, when you grow a rose on its own roots, then they actually break from the base and they produce more bushier plants. And that is something we usually like, to have a nice full bushy plant rather than a sticky job that you're more likely to get with a grafted. And apparently 2 to 3 years is the normal time for a rose that's on its own roots to catch up with the one that had been grafted and grown for the same length of time. So that's interesting, it doesn't take long. The reason that I like roses on their own roots is because they're so easy from cutting. So if I see a rose in someone's garden that I love, I can take a cutting, get it rooted. And I've got a rose rooted and grown in the garden in a couple of years or so. So to my mind, roses on their own roots, they're better, they are more bushy, they're obviously cheaper if you can propagate them yourself, costing you nothing, as opposed to in the retail, they're quite expensive, about £17 or something now. So that is my preference, and I think that you should actively try and grow your own or seek out someone that does grow them on their own roots. And I think in a few years, they will become much more order of the day. A big reason that they were grafted in the UK is because you can produce a point of sale plant quicker by grafting it onto a rootstock, but it is an expensive procedure for the grower to do. Another point of issue I have is that people always say that the best time to take a cutting of a rose is in the autumn or winter. But when I see one in someone's garden and it's a beautiful flower, that's when I take it. And they root perfectly then. I root them in my hydropod and they root in 3 weeks. Now this is pearl drift. In this really, really dry summer on my very thin soil, it's done better of any of my roses. It's still doing a good second flowering and not a lot of black spot. And when I take a cutting, I'll try and take one without a flower, if I can find one without the flower bud. But if I couldn't, I'd take it with the flower bud and cut the flower bud off. So I'd take about 150 mil, so I'd take it off there. I'd remove those lower leaves, take it off just below the leaf joint, cut it there, take off the top, pop it in the hydropod, and that will root in about 3 weeks. So I'd then pot it on, I'd grow it on next year in a container probably, and then I'll put it out in the garden the following year. Sometimes I plant them out when they're much smaller, just a few months old, but you just have to watch them. They are more vulnerable from rabbits or pests or dogs or something like that. But that way you can grow lovely big groups of roses and it costs you nothing. The next conundrum that many gardens have is dahlias. Should you lift them or shouldn't you? And I think it's generally the problem with leaving them in the ground is slugs. So I do use organic slug pellets, and I find this works very well. I don't use very many. In fact, this year was so dry, I don't think I use any. And coffee grounds are very good, and I have loads of those as well. So I think unless you're very cold, if I mound over bark, mulch, anything I've got in the winter, so I put it on in autumn, when they've died down, I mound them up so they're nice and cozy, they're protected from the frost. And then I leave them, I watch out for when they're coming, see what the slug damage is like, and then if it's wet and miserable, then I'll give them some organic slug pellets, maybe coffee ground, something like that. And I was totally convinced on this when I spoke to a dahlia grower, and they said definitely the biggest cause of death in dahlia tubers is lifting the dahlias. And that for me spells it all out. I also find they grow into much bigger clumps like that, and I like these bigger, bushy, self-supporting clumps. Now, interestingly, I was listening to Klaus Dalby, who grows, is it 2,000 to 3,000 containers in his amazing garden, and he grows his dahlias in pots. And I've got this dahlia, this is creme de cassis, obviously in this big pot here, which I love. I think it looks very nice, very eye-catching. And the reason he grows his in pots is because he hasn't got room in his borders to actually plant them. So therefore he just grows them in pots, and then I imagine he plonks them in the border where he wants them. So if you want to do that, that's perfect. But my gosh, the watering of all those dahlias in those pots, if you've got lots of labour and you want to do that, that's fine. But in my garden, my labour, me one day a week, Dave one day a week, and we've got a lot here, and we're pretty self-sufficient in fruit and veg as well. So there's no way I could contemplate growing my dahlias in pots. And in the borders, in these nice big stonking clumps, they hold their own anyway, and they really show up. So I like that. But I have got a few other dahlias in pots, and I'll just show them, only because I had the odd tuber and it wouldn't make sense on its own, I didn't think, and I thought I'd try growing it in a pot. But I do water them a lot, and I feed them, and that is a lot of work for me, so it's limited to 1 or 2 pots. So this is my this year's favourite dahlia. It changes all the time. I'm a bit, what should we call it, fluid on that one. Anyway, it's Bacardi, and I love it because it starts off like this beautiful colour, and then it fades and fades. I've just snapped this one off accidentally, you'll have to go in a vase, to this, and then it gets paler, and I just think it's such a lovely dahlia. And so I've popped it in this plot, and I've taken loads of cuttings of this. I've got about 10 going on, and I see because I've taken cuttings, I'm getting a lot of new growth, so I'll be able to take a load more as well. And then I will plant them out next June in the borders, and I'll have Bacardi in my borders everywhere. The next thing that you always read is when you take root cuttings. Now, I don't know if any of you take root cuttings, and I have to say I rarely do because I find stem cuttings much easier. But you basically lift the plant out of the ground, get the roots, chop them into sort of inch segments, usually straight across at the top, and then you put a diagonal slant on the cut on the lower one, purely so you can recognise which is top and bottom, and then you pop them in some gritty compost. And they always say, the books, that you do this in the dormant season, and this is typically done with anemones. I've got some nice anemones here I found in a friend's garden that she didn't want, and they look white, but actually they've got quite a pale pink to them, and they're nothing like as vigorous as the common white Japanese anemone Honoré Joubert, which I love, but it is just so extravagant, it grows everywhere. But this seems a lot more gentle, so I've got it round my little seat here with this lovely pink amistad. Actually, the blue amistad sort of came out and took the world by storm. Nobody seems to like this one so much. It hasn't taken off, but it survived here last winter. It's in very dry shade, and it's actually doing pretty well. You couldn't get much drier shade than here, right at the foot of this big old apple tree. Anyway, so they say take the root cuttings when they're dormant, and I found them, I haven't had a great success rate with them. And a nurseryman friend said what they do is they just lift a plant, they just go boom, 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 chop it all up, throw it in a seed tray, and they do it really quickly, and they find that works. But someone else told me that actually the key is taking it when the plant is actually growing. And this is a bit counterintuitive. So I'd go and I'd lift up this anemone. I would then take the root cuttings, pot them up, and then I would put that back in the ground. And obviously, you know, you'd selectively do it. You might divide it at the same time, but you wouldn't. You'd take a bit of roots of all the plants probably if you didn't want to kill the mother plant. And that is much more effective because you're doing it when the plant is actively growing, and the root cuttings you'll get a much better percentage with. So the other thing, I mean, anemones is a common one to do it with, and phlox. But again, with phlox, I will always take a stem cutting when they emerge in spring and they're just coming out of the ground like that. You take those little stem cuttings and even in just in a straight little pot with half perlite, half compost, or else in my hydropod. Hydropod they'll root in a couple of weeks. In a little pot they take a little bit longer. But those spring cuttings of many herbaceous plants are so easy to do when they're very young. Early on they root, most things root very quickly, very easily, and then you've got loads of plants to grow on in your borders for the growing season. When we did the last recording last Friday on Gardener's Question Time, somebody said they inherited a new garden. It was rubbish topsoil full of perennial weeds, and what could he do to get rid of the perennial weeds, and he didn't want to use chemicals. Now I thought this was interesting because the chair said to me, Bunny, he does not want to use chemicals. And so another panel member suggested that, well, one of them suggested if you put down carpet or some sort of cover, then that would stop them. But that would take 6 years or so to get rid of the bindweed and everything. And who wants to wait 6 years with carpet or a fabric on their garden before they start doing it? No one. And someone else suggested, well, you get a JCB, you dig it all out, take away the rubbish and bring in new topsoil. And I just think the whole environmental question on this is quite extraordinary, really, because the amount of effort you do to digging down 600 mil to get rid of everything, carting it away in a lorry, bringing in new topsoil is massive. Whereas if you just did a little bit of chemical treatment to the bindweed and things, and it would have probably taken, it was a small garden, it would have probably taken me 2 applications of half an hour each, and then that would be sorted, and then I'll just bring in a load of bulky organic matter that I could get free, such as my ray meal that I get from tree surgeons or my digestate or something like that, and the problem would be solved. And I think environmentally that would be much better. So just think, and I also know of a well-known gardener that did exactly that, dug out his border full of perennial weeds because it was organic to 600 mil, put new soil in, but then the bindweed and everything came back from under the stone walls that surrounded the borders, so it came back in. So it didn't even then solve the problem. Now there are electrical weeders. You can hire these machines or buy one if you've got very deep pockets. I think they're about 8K, and they boil the roots by supercharging it with electricity. But even then, if you've got something like a big infestation of mare's tail or something, it takes about 6 years to keep repeating the applications till you finally get rid of every little bit. So it's no quick, no cheap thing. If you keep digging them out, that's fine, but the thing is, when you dig the perennial weeds, you are dividing it up often as not, leaving bits in there, so you're basically propagating it. So just think, when you've got a problem such as perennial weeds, you might be very organic, but you've also got to think about the repercussions of other ways that you're dealing with them, and maybe they are not as good, or maybe they are even worse than the use of a well-judged, well-played herbicide. So I'm just raising the question, and I can hear all of you highly organic gardens screaming, saying no glyphosate, no glyphosate, but sometimes I think it is the best answer. Another discussion we had whilst recording the other day was that we'd been to a plant show the week before, and we'd all bought plants from the lovely nursery stalls there. and it has been exceptionally hot and dry. We haven't had rain for months, and it's been really, really sunny. And they all said to me, oh, we haven't planted them because it's been so hot and dry. We haven't planted them, we've just left them in their pots. And I thought that's a bit strange, really, because when you've got something in a pot, it's still going to have the same heat. Okay, you can put it in the shade for a bit, but it's still got the same heat, and you've got to water it just as if it was in the ground. And I do remember in Italy, they often do move plants in high summer because they're almost going to a summer dormancy. And so they then move them, plant them, water them, and they get going very fast. And the reason we're here is because I transplanted these globe artichoke plants, which I grew from seed, probably sowed them about a month or two ago. And this bed does look a bit messy because I've left my verbascum seedlings and my strawberries in there. But it was very high, hot, dry weather, and I literally lifted some of them out of a row because I sowed them in rows directly in the beds with a view to moving them, and I dug them out with a trowel, and they have very long, deep tap roots. And it was really sunny, so you think, this silly woman, why does she do that then? But I just wanted to get on and fill this bed, and this bed's always been a bit difficult. For some reason, it's always full of slugs. And so I thought, well, I'll put a real slug in there. So I moved them, but I've watered them. I watch them each day, and in this, we've had every day until today, we've had very hot weather. I've got some shade netting, just show you. I've got some shade netting, and when it's really sunny, I just put over a couple of layers of this, having watered them. I take them off at night, and after about 2 or 3 days of that treatment, you see they've now picked up and we've got some new growth. So that is in only 5-7 days, I think that is. And they went through the floppy dop stage, looked like they're going to die, carry on water and shading, maybe once a day, maybe twice a day in this really hot weather we've had. And they're now getting away, they're growing. So they do respond. If you want to move something at the wrong time of year and you give it the right conditions, that's fine. And it's only half a can each, it's not like gallons and gallons. But always when I plant new things at a dry time of year, I will dig a hole, which I did for these. I pour in some water into the hole, and that will be a good 2 gallons, maybe 1 gallon. I then soak the plant. These I didn't because they were bare rooted, so they just had a long tap root. But if it's in a container, I'll soak the plant in a bucket until all the air bubbles have gone. Then I pop the plant in the hole, put the soil around it, water it, and then add the shade netting if it's hot. And then I watch it, and I might water it daily for that first few days if it is very hot and dry and windy. So never follow the books dogmatically, but just think about what you're doing. These now will grow away really fast, so by October I'll have lovely nice plants, and they will give me globe artichokes, I reckon, next summer. Hooray! I love growing sweet corn. It is really delicious plants. Always the books say you must grow in blocks, and the reason they say it has to be grown in blocks is because it's wind pollinated. The male flowers come at the top of the plant, and then apparently the wind drops them down onto the female flowers below. So I thought, really, is this so? And as I always question everything, I planted 3 sweet corn plants in my polytunnel. Now my polytunnel does not have wind. They're in a sheltered corner of the polytunnel, and there's only 3 plants there, so it's not a big block. My sweet corn plants have formed lovely kernels, and they've all been fertilised. So what is it? Why is it that I can grow plants? And I'm not watering from overhead, so the water's not causing the fertilisation. I'm watering at the ground. So I think that is totally unnecessary to plant sweet corn in blocks. The very fact that I've got them in the polytunnel with just 3 plants in a sheltered corner, and they formed lovely cobs with all the kernels being fertilised. I just think it's one of those funny rumours. Or maybe varieties have changed and that's not necessary now. The other thing that is, I think, completely ridiculous about cooking sweet corn is they always say you should pick the cobs, run into the house, throw them in boiling water, because the sugars change as soon as you pick them, and they're modified and they don't taste nearly as sweet if you don't use them very quickly after picking. Now, the varieties of sweet corn now are so sweet, you really wouldn't want them any sweeter. They're almost unbearably sweet, I think, some of them. And B, I would never throw my corn of the cob into water, because I think as soon as you put something full of sugar into water and boil it, most of the goodness goes away and dissolves into the water. So I always just pick them, leave them in their lovely cases that they grow naturally, the green cases. I just bung them in the oven and I just roast them like that for about 20 minutes. And then I pull them out, pull away the leaves, and you have this so sweet, beautiful sweet corn that has not had all the goodness washed away by the heavily boiling water, that you could have nothing nicer. The age-old conundrum: we were always told to put crocks and a drainage layer in the bottom of pots before planting them. Now, this has been proven. People have done experiments of this, and they've said that the drainage, if you mix that same granular material that you're putting in the bottom of the pot, if you mix it in the compost, you would have sharper, better drainage. This has been proven time and time again. But still, because it's in all those gardening books which were published and written before this knowledge came out, they tell you, people will tell you to still put that drainage layer at the bottom, but don't. It's really proven to be wrong. If you want it to be sharp drainage, then obviously mix the drainage material throughout it. Now, I actually don't bother with any of these plants here. I haven't got drainage in the base of the pot at all, because I don't want them to drain massively. These are summer pots. I want them to hold on to the moisture, and I want them to all grow well. So I won't put any drainage material. If they've got a big hole in the bottom of the pot, I'll put a crock over it just to stop the compost washing through. Now, the problem that you will get with drainage in pots is if you leave the same plant in the pot for a long, long time, 5, 10 years, and you've used compost in the pot, the compost will break down and you won't have any air left in the compost, any air holes, because compost has lots of air holes in it which fill with water and air, and it allows the plant roots to grow. Now, when it breaks down, you don't have those lovely holes in it, and so it gets very claggy, and so effectively the compost won't drain, and then the plant dies, and it looks a bit like it's dying from drought because it can't get the water because the compost is so claggy and there's no air in it. So that is usually a long-term problem that many people get when they plant plants in compost in pots. Everyone talks about lasagna planting and they say it's wonderful, but I really think it's way, way overhyped. I think because it's got that catchy title, lasagna planting, it sounds delicious, it sounds great, everybody bangs on about it. But one year I did a pot of tulips, and I planted them in the 3 layers, and I put them in early, medium, late, and then I did another pot and I put the same 3 tulips, but absolutely cheap by jowl, in another pot exactly the same size, and put them all in 1 layer, and there was no difference. Now, people often do lasagna planting because they say they're going to have a crocus, they have an early bulb, a middle, and then they'll have maybe a tulip, and then maybe a daffodil or something at 3 different layers, and then obviously the crocus would come first, then the daff, and then the tulip. But even people like Klaus Dolby, who has 2,000 or 3,000 pots in his garden and loves container planting and does it beautifully, he thinks it's totally overhyped because they just don't grow so well. And also sometimes the little bulbs get pushed out by the bigger bulbs that are pushing up underneath them. And also you get the dying foliage of one type of flower dying off as the other one comes up through. So it's very difficult to keep these lasagna planting bulbs looking really good. It's just something that's taken off and social media goes bonkers about it. But really, if you want to put bulbs in pots, and they do look wonderful, I think it's simplest really to put one type of tulip in one pot. And if you want to have more, then have others coming on in another cheap pot that then you replace in the bigger pot later, if you see what I mean. So you can use your lovely big pot, but have 3 types of bulb in cheaper, not so nice pots and just rotate them in the big nice pot. Haven't put that very succinctly, but I hope you know what I mean. So forget about lasagna planting. Keep it for the kitchen, it's delicious in there. The last one is digging over your borders. I think most people have got the idea now that when you dig the soil, you destroy the microorganisms or greatly reduce them in the soil in that top 6 centimetres of soil, which is rich with microorganisms and things like that. You destroy those, you break up the structure. It's really not good at all. So I never dig over any borders. My vegetable, I just put on garden, I just put mulch on the top each year whenever I've got some, whenever I'm doing anything. My flower borders, the same, my mixed borders, I just put mulch on the top. I would never dig them over. I might, if I did have cooch in there, I'd be propagating the cooch. I'd probably be digging up plants I'd forgotten I got in there. It's back-breaking work, it's bad for the soil. Maybe it's good for the soul because it feels that you've done some physical work, but go and dig a compost heap or something instead. You know, it's something more productive that's good. And just forget that you ever need to dig. It does look lovely when it's freshly dug, but that's its only plus point. So from a very dry garden, I hope you found these conundrums useful. I always think, just weigh up a problem, see what you think, experiment. And remember, just like the news, not everything you read in gardening books is true.